So let's look at the best games in Hearthstone. Oh no. Before we get into today's video, I just want to let you guys know that I'm currently streaming over at twitch.tv/ClarkHellScream if you're checking out this video a couple of hours after it's posted, to where I am actually playing the best decks on the ladder at the best ranks, because I am currently rank 500 legend, and I started around rank 3000, so I have climbed an astonishing amount of ranks since the patch has gone live, and it's with one of these decks that I'm featuring in this list. So if you want to see me crush the ladder with what I believe is the best deck in Hearthstone, go ahead and check out twitch.tv/ClarkHellScream, where hopefully I'm going to be climbing to top 200 legend. Maybe we shouldn't get too crazy or too ahead of ourselves, but I will be playing what I believe is the best deck in the game. And that raises the question, what do I believe is the best deck in the game? It's Good Warrior. Good Warrior is amazing. Enrage Rift Warrior is finally a legitimate deck to where if we look on HSReplay, it is actually sitting at tier 1 since the patch has gone live and top 1000 legend. And we'll get to the HSReplay stats here in a minute when I go into some more detail about where exactly I'm finding this data from. But this is the deck that I have had the most amount of success with, and I'll show you my stats here in a second, but let me go ahead and show you what you could potentially sub out of this deck, because there are a lot of people that are saying that school teachers aren't necessarily worth it. So some people are actually taking out school teachers, putting in an instrument tech as well as one Acolyte of Pain. This is from the same person that popularized this list, Thor HS on the Hearthstone Reddits, and this is his final list. And there's a reason why I'm keeping the school teachers, just because I'm still winning with this deck without these inclusions. But the reason why Instrument Tech and Acolyte of Pain in this deck are just to give you as much cycle as possible, because there are some situations to where the deck, it's good at cycling, but when you hit the cards that don't actually help you draw, then it can feel like this deck doesn't have a lot of cycle tools in it, even though, believe me, it does have a lot of ways of being able to draw important minions because of cards like Roaring Applause, because of synergies with Light of the Phoenix, as well as being able to sometimes find stuff off of the Naga. But really, Instrument Tech draws you the weapon in order to always have it by turn 3, which is super crucial in a lot of matchups, and Acolyte of Pain can just be a much needed extra tool. And when you're making, you know, minions +5/+5, having a 6/8 minion that draws a card every single time it's damaged can really go a long way. But what is the real strength of this deck? The strength of this deck is being able to play out many different ways that isn't just, you know, play 2-drop on 2, play 3-drop on 3, etc, etc. And I've looked at some of the stats on this deck, and it's kind of surprising how many people are not keeping Bridge Riff when they are playing this deck. This is an absolute must keep in a lot of matchups, especially if you're on coin, because you want to get this value brewing as soon as possible in order to swing the game back around. But just to give you guys a quick idea of what to mulligan for with this deck, you usually want to always keep Anima Extractor, you want to keep the Axe, you want to keep Fire Chicken, as I like to call it, and Bridge Riff. These are the 4 most important cards that make this deck sing. But if you are playing Instrument Tech, then obviously you would add that into your mulligan, because, you know, you always want the weapon. But the power of this deck is being able to play on tempo, being able to play for combo, and being able to play for just general pressure throughout the entire game. And one of my videos that I just posted a couple of days ago really showcases how good of a high roll this deck can have, even if your opponent is playing Thaddius Warlock and summons like 3 Thaddiuses. It's absolutely insane what this deck can do. I cannot recommend a deck high enough, because if an idiot like me can hit rank 500 legend with a deck like this, then all it takes is just a little bit of finesse and a little bit of, you know, learning the deck in order for you to also do well with it. But the main reason why I decided to keep in the Nagalings and to keep the school teachers is because, honestly, I might just be on the copium of this card, but I like the curve that it generates. Like, you have your 3-drop weapon into a school teacher, which can sometimes be good if you don't have your Fire Chicken. But if you look at the spells that are actually available for Warrior, one of the most important spells that I want to be able to find at times is Execute. Like, this is one of the main reasons why I'm running it in this deck. You have Execute, you have your Verse Riffs, and your Chorus Riff as well, and I've already talked about the synergy with the Nagaling. But if you have Bridge Riff as your last riff, and then you play Nagaling with a riff as a finale, it will automatically trigger that Bridge Riff. But if you play another Verse Riff, the actual spell, as a finale, then it will finale the Bridge Riff instead of doing the verse or chorus that came out of the Nagaling. That's the funny thing about Nagaling and why originally the creator of the deck put it into the deck. But cards like Bash, Slam, Blazing Power on your Ramornia in order to give it an additional buff, Guard the City for taunts. Riot has been extremely good for me in order to try and get the board back in case the Nagalings come down a little bit slower. Finding draw off of this, finding scam. This isn't a great card, but I picked it for content, and I have won once with it, and that is already, you know, good enough in my opinion. But the main reason why is because of Roaring Applause and because of the Riffs, and now that From the Depths is 3 mana, I've actually chosen this a couple of times, but this isn't an auto pick like it used to be back in the day. So From the Depths is definitely feeling more like a fair card versus just being 3 mana, win the game automatically because of your cheating 15 mana. But regardless, I cannot recommend this deck highly enough, so if you wanted to take a warrior deck that can actually climb, I would highly recommend this deck. And now let's get into the decks that I haven't really played all too much, but I've heard so many people talking about. Apparently, Relic Demon Hunter is doing really good right now at all forms of play, and this might be the safest deck to play if you're just looking to get the easiest, swiftest legend that you can possibly get. The deck, it plays very, very similarly. I don't really think I need to explain to people how to play Relics. Like, this is the easiest deck to mulligan for because you quite literally just keep the cards that say Relic in it. The hardest part about this deck is being able to know which win conditions you're supposed to go for. So, case in point, against like a Blood DK, which honestly aren't too popular nowadays, you want to try and go for Fizzle Lady combos in order to make the most gigantic Lady damage combos that you can possibly generate. And now that Predation is dealing 2 damage instead of 3 damage, this can sometimes make a difference, but I still think that Lady Sethnana with Predation is just absolutely busted because it is still dealing 4 to the face, and since you have a Rowdy fan, it really doesn't matter if you're taking off 1 damage off the Predation. This is still an extremely good deck and is becoming the go-to deck to beat in Legend, to where if you can beat Relic Demon Hunter, then your deck's pretty much already doing well at top 1000 Legend. And that's where most of these stats are coming from. They're coming from top 1000 Legend. And if we actually take a look at HSReplay, we can kind of see the stats varying a little bit, although Paladin is still on top, and trust me, Pure Paladin is in this list. It's the deck that's carrying Paladin way too much right now. But Priest is doing really good now. Death Knight is still in a good position. Hunter is above Demon Hunter, so I believe that the Relic phase is actually starting to kind of go out a little bit, just because people are understanding that if you can beat Relic Demon Hunter, then you are doing really well at top 1000 Legend. And then on the way to Legend, I believe that people are just not making the proper decisions with Relic Demon Hunter, because sometimes this is a deck that forces you to play a very specific way in certain matchups, so that way you can not only, you know, destroy the board, but swing it back in your favor to where you're suddenly, you know, dealing damage with all of the Relic of Phantasms and whatnot. But this is the funny thing about looking at stats, is that everyone at top 1000 Legend is saying that Relic Demon Hunter is the go-to deck to beat, but the stats aren't even saying that. The stats are saying that these are the best decks in the game, and decks like Face Hunter, I just don't see. Decks like Burn Mage, I don't really see all too well, especially Menagerie Warrior. Like, I don't think that these stats are 100% the go-to to, you know, figure out what the best decks in the game are, but it is nice to have these kind of stats in order to show us what people are playing. Looking into Legend, though, you can already see like a massive swing. Like, you see Burn Mage still up here, you see Face Hunter up here, probably because they're just quick aggressive decks, but Frosty K, Pure Paladin, Undead Priest, Unholy Death Knight, Outcast Demon Hunter, Totem Shaman, you're seeing all of these decks that are aggressive and probably don't want to go up against Priest. So now I'm gonna have to show you guys what is getting a lot of attention right now, especially from the top 100 Legend crowd. But Control Priest is absolutely taking over right now in every single regard, and I realize that I have to, you know, change my face because I used the wrong source. But let's not think about that. Instead, let's think about how Control Priest is ruining the game, because oh my god, this deck is taking over, dude. Steam Cleaner, Sister, and Theatar within the ETC. I'm kind of surprised this isn't in the main deck, but I'm imagining that you don't really want that card unless you're trying to, like, outvalue, like, another control gamer, for example. So that's probably the main reason why the Sister is in here, so you can focus on being as anti-fun as possible against as many decks as you physically can queue into. And according to the Meat Man, apparently this deck is favored into everything except Relic Demon Hunter, but he is still 9-8 in this matchup. And this is the thing, like, the first day of the patch, everyone was talking about Enrage Warrior, was talking about Relic Demon Hunter, and was talking about Control Priest, and all 3 of those decks are doing extremely good right now, to where the meta is already starting to shift towards beating those decks, which is why their stats might be a little bit lower, because people are going so hard in order to beat these decks, but they are still performing so well. And just, oh my god, I really don't want Control Priest to be a thing in this meta, but I have to acknowledge it because Meati is ranked 2 and Rank 3 on 2 different servers with a 50 and 27 score, which is, unga bunga, dude. There's no other way to explain it. But yeah, if you're someone who doesn't want to believe in the Control Priest Copium, trust me, it actually is not Copium. It's a very real deck. And I am very concerned that if this becomes the norm, then we're in for another Barons meta, and we all know how that went. But continuing on the trend of Demon Hunter being good, Outcast Rancher. This is just still an extremely good deck because this deck did not get really affected by the nerfs all too much, except obviously for the Predation. But the Predation being 3 damage really is not all too important when the functionality of this deck is still exactly how it was. It's not even about the Predations, it's about being able to fill up your board with 1/1s, so that way if you play Rush minions, you're buffing up the entire board. It's just about being sticky and about dealing as much damage as physically possible. But with this deck, I would argue that the most important thing to keep in mind is mulligan and matchup and how to play against certain matchups, because I see a lot of people playing this deck very I guess incorrectly is just the best way to play it. Like, there are times where you want to play securities for tempo in order to force a certain opponent to either play defensively or to play off of their proactive game plan, but you don't just want to throw this card out all willy-nilly. This is an extremely useful resource, especially if you find it off of Illidari Studies. You can find some extra copies, so maybe that's a reason to throw out an additional one if you just have it in the Outcast and you want to make room on the other Outcast side of your hand. But regardless, I think that this deck has a lot of potential, and even though Demon Hunter does get a lot of rep for being very, I guess, unfun and uninteractive, I would argue that this is probably the deck that has the most amount of decisions that get rewarded if you play them correctly. I promise, guys, I promise I have some new decks coming up here, but I gotta point out that Miracle Rogue is still an extremely good deck, and it's mostly because this deck does good into everything that isn't Control Priest right now. I've been doing really good against Rogue because Enrage Warrior seems to do pretty decent against this deck, unless they have the high roll with Cult Neophyte and the Sinstone Graveyard just happening at the same turn to where you really can't stop the turn that they generate because your spells cost 2 to 3 more mana. And unfortunately for Warrior, my spells are kind of important at times. But aside from that, Miracle Rogue is still an extremely efficient deck to where I believe people are finally satisfied on the build that has been created, because there were a lot of people that were like, Cult Neophyte is God, versus other people saying that Cult Neophyte is absolutely terrible. So it's finally good to see that this deck is actually solidified now, and if you're someone that likes Miracle Rogue, this deck really hasn't gone anywhere. It's just its matchups were not the greatest in the previous patch, but now that some of its weaker matchups, like Blood DK, have been properly nerfed, so it's not just getting removed every single turn, fighting for tempo makes a lot of sense, especially considering with the stats that I just showed you where most of the decks are tempo decks. This deck can really shine against decks that aren't being too aggressive to the face or summoning gigantic boards. But if you're looking for a more fun way to play Rogue, I actually have an interesting deck from Jombre where I believe he went 17-9. I'll pull the tweet here in a second in order to pull up his comments on the deck. But Pirate Secret Dagger Rogue is apparently a thing, and I went up against someone going all in on playing Pirates and the Dagger, so I'm imagining what Jombre is thinking of here is to add a little bit of disruption and to try and like add a little bit of ways your opponent can screw up in order to give you the initiative, because the secrets can go a long way at disrupting your opponent, especially with cards like Perjury pulling, you know, Mage and Hunter secrets. But the power of this deck lies in the Swordfish. The whole point of this deck is to play Swordfish as soon as possible, start buffing it with like cards like Harmonic Bop, and in the other deck that I was playing, it ran cards like Deadly Poison, but this is exactly where Jombre is using his creative deck building in order to take the deck in a little bit of a more mid-range instead of an aggro direction, because if you go up against taunts, this deck actually falls extremely flat, and that's exactly what happened. I played 1/2 taunt against the Rogue with a 15 attack weapon, and they had lethal if they would have hit me in the face, but that one taunt got in the way, because look at what else is in this deck. Like, there's Bone, there's Astalor, and those are the only other damage cards that aren't just your weapon. So it's very important for you to use your secrets, to use your minions, and to not just use your weapon, because this isn't Kingsbane Rogue. You actually have to try and use your other cards in order to make the weapon even more of a threat. You have 0 mana Corsairs, and there's even a Hook Tusk, which it's really fun just to see this card in the deck, because you don't see a lot of people messing around with this card, but Jombre has been doing very well with it. And here's exactly his stats with the deck. He went 19-9, so 17-9. It was almost there. 68% win rate, testing out the mid-range Pirate Rogue and top 100 Legends. So this is not something you're going to be seeing throughout all ranks unless you're tuning into Jombre's stream. But yep, does extremely well with the deck in top 100 Legend. I don't really think there's too many things in these screenshots here outside of that. But his mulligan advice is to go for Private Eye, Swordfish, Jolly Roger, Prep Bone Spike with Private Eye. So if you have coin, you can probably keep the Private Eye as like a way to coin it out on turn 3 to get the most amount of value out of this card. I would highly recommend checking out Jombray's stream. Pure Paladin is still good. Do I need to talk about it? I'll talk about it just a little bit, because there are some things that are different in the deck. The Vicious Syndicate deck list is now by far the most powerful version of Pure Paladin, because being able to slap Guardian's Grace when you've been playing a bunch of buff cards throughout the entire game is actually a lot more powerful than people are considering, especially when you add Order in the Court to get this combo out consistently. So you're either getting a 5-5 with Divine Shield and stats, or a 5-5 with Taunt in stats for almost 0 mana most of the time. And there's even gotten to the point where people are now running the 7 mana removal card, because throughout the early stages of Paladin, you're dealing a lot of damage. You still have Disco Maul being absolutely broken. I think we need to nerf this card to 3 mana Blizzard, just throwing that out there. But this dragon does give you a little bit of comeback ability against decks that do still generate gigantic taunts, or against like the Warriors, for example, generating a gigantic board, and then suddenly you need something to deal with that because you're almost there and you just need that last bit of damage. Like imagine like your opponent's at like 15 health, you haven't killed them yet, you do this, get rid of their board, they can't do anything, and then suddenly you just slap double Guardian's Grace on this. That's 18 damage by turn 8 if you've played some spells to help support it, and there's just not a lot to talk about Pure Paladin that's all too interesting, but at least now they're running a 7 mana dragon, and it's not just unga bunga play stats as quickly as possible, and it can get drawn from the Pure Raider in a very real way. And honestly, some Pure Paladin decks weren't even running this card, so at least with this list, you are running a lot more interesting cards. But if you're playing the old version of Pure Paladin, it's probably just still going to work. Okay, I can't say just as well, because I do believe this deck is much better and will give you a higher win rate. But let's be honest, Pure Paladin's the best deck in the game because of Disco Maul. If we want to nerf Pure Paladin, we got to hit this card. Now we're going to start talking about the Death Knights, and really there's not all too much to talk about because they're either the same deck or they've completely fallen out. And I'll just go ahead and spoil it. Blood DK is no longer on this list, so if you're someone that hates Blood DK, you can at least, rest with the fact that it is the least popular Death Knight deck out there right now. Even though, when I was playing a lot these past couple of days, there were a lot of people trying to still make Blood DK work, because there are, the aggressive decks in the meta that Blood Boil still very much destroys. But Blood DK is actually disappearing from the ladder to where more people are starting to play Frost and Unholy right now, because more aggressive strategies seem to be working a little bit more consistently than just hoping that you draw Blood Boil on turn 5 every single time, which is why I'm not too upset that that kind of card exists. But the reason why Frost DK is working is because if you remember the stats that I showed you from HSReplay going to Legend, it's a lot of tempo decks. It's a lot of decks that don't like the idea of getting Frostworm Furied, and this deck just still has a lot of damage to where it can win without board locking the board anyway. So it's just one of those decks to where it's always going to be kind of like the boogeyman. I just wish that like the list would change up a little bit, because this is almost exactly how it looked before Festival of Legends was even added into the game, and cards like Rowdy Fan do help out this deck with adding a little bit more of a burst option. But I just wish that Frost DK had a more control way of being played. I wish it had more of a mid-range way of being played. I kind of wish that aggro wasn't just everyone's go-to, but it's working, and Might of Menethil is a pretty busted card. So if you want to play Frost DK, it's now available. And if you want to play boring old regular Unholy DK, it is still available pretty much as is. The nerf to Battlefield Necromancer was important, don't get me wrong, but it's still an extremely powerful card against board-based decks that don't have a deal 2 damage card in hand. Decks like Warrior can deal with this card a little bit more, because you only need to deal 2 damage AoE, but again, unless you're running like a spell that says deal damage, or like you have Astalor on turn 5 immediately after they play this on turn 4, I really don't think that the 2-3 stat line makes too much of a difference outside of the matchups that was already pretty good, because Control Priest does decently against this deck because of how much removal they have. Obviously, like, Control Priest is going to destroy this deck, but if you want to play something a little bit different, if you want to play a new version of Unholy DK, I have yet to test this deck, and I unfortunately can't find the tweet of where whoever was talking about this, but the reason why I'm extremely interested in this deck is because of ETC Band Manager running Alexstrasza Lifebinder, the Scourge, and Sunwell. Now we're cooking, right? Now we've got a pretty interesting deck, and it is very similar to the Murloc build of this deck that I highlighted a couple of weeks ago. I still think that this version has a decent amount of potential for it because it can cycle a bit more, and the synergies with Murmy are very real to work with the Necromancer as well as Nerubian Vizier for that for a different kind of 1-2-3 high roll. Now that you have, you know, many different ways of being able to set up that 1-2-3 high roll, I like diversity. But I think that this deck has a little bit of potential because the ETC is going to take a lot of people by surprise. You have Burst, you have Board, or you have a Hail Mary against like control decks, for example. I just think there's a lot going on with this list, but the ETC is really enticing me to try out this deck. And if you want a different way of playing Unholy DK, this would be my recommendation to not go crazy just playing the exact same deck we've been playing for months. Now we have to ask the question, is Warlock good? It's okay. I've been having some issues trying to find the good Warlock deck, so I hate to say that I'm playing it safe with the choices that I'm showing you here. But Thaddius Warlock has been making a lot of strides recently, and this is a build by No Hands Gamer that is focusing more on the scam potential with Thaddius, more than just, you know, obviously draw the Thaddius and then somehow sustain with Warlock late game. Now we have cards like Alexstrasza. Alexstrasza is just making a comeback now in this deck in order to give us a little bit more burst options, because, you know, Drekthir is pretty cool on your odd polarities, but what if instead of dealing 16, you dealt 15? Makes a lot of sense when you take into account how good Thaddius can be at just automatically winning the game. The one thing I really don't like about this deck is that it's just, you know, it's play Slime, play Voidcaller, and then somehow win the game afterwards. And if you don't have these cards, you have to kind of finagle your way out of whatever situation that you've been put into. But that's why cards like Habeas Corpse can be extremely useful, so that way if you do have your Voidcaller die, you can immediately bring it back in case you don't get the high roll with it. In case your Thaddius gets dealt with immediately, you have this in order to bring it back for even more scam. So I love how this card is finally playable. But one thing that's really worrying me about Warlock in particular is that there are no other decks that are really working as well as Thaddius Warlock. And I do have one more Warlock deck to show you. It is a control Warlock, but if you're going to ask me about like Imp Lock, about Fatigue Imp, Zoo, unfortunately those decks are just the weakest in terms of aggro decks that are available to be played right now, and it's kind of insane to think about how mighty the Vile Library has fallen. But if you're someone that likes the idea of making Curse Warlock work, then this is probably the best list that you can try out, because I've seen a lot of people, including myself, trying to make Curse Warlock work now that the Symphony of Sins is 5 mana. And trust me, this card being at 5 mana is a very big deal for Control Warlock, but it's just not really helping Curse Warlock all too much because this deck is very dependent on certain matchups. But there was one person that was able to play this deck to great success. It was Savitz. Savitz went 27 and 11 off stream with Curse Warlock. A little bit shady there on the stats there, Savitz. Huh? You couldn't do this live, huh? Nah, don't worry. I couldn't do it live either. But he ended up doing really well with this deck, going from 3,000 to 600-ish, and that's about like, you know, where I went with Warrior and ended with Warrior. So if he could do the same thing with Warlock, that is not just saying a lot about what Warlock is capable of, but Savitz is just a really good gamer as well. And there's been a couple of people messing with this list, but I like the idea of running the Harp in order to, you know, make your taps a little bit more effective in order to stop the Symphony of Sins deal 6 from hitting you in the face. It just makes sense to run this card as just an overall, like, healing tool when tapping really isn't something you want to be doing nowadays, because if you deal 4 damage to yourself by, like, turn 5, that's a lot of damage for the aggro deck. They can sometimes, you know, make that extremely worth their time, even though you're running cards like Armor Vendor and some other healing cards. Like, if you just tap for 4 and you're not healing, it does make a difference. But the Demolition Renovator, to try and stop a lot of the Relic Demon Hunters, the Priests, the Miracle Rogues, and even the Enraged Warriors that you're going to see on ladder, this card is making a real comeback in decks, being a tradable card now. And I gotta give credit to Blizzard for turning such an unplayable card into an actual, you know, tool that people can use. I was kind of confused on why this card didn't have tradable at the beginning, and if you want my honest opinion, all cards that are like destroy, you know, a location, destroy an enemy weapon, like Viper, all those cards should just have tradable, because you never want this card just to be sitting in your hand waiting for its time, waiting for its opportunity to be good, because there are going to be matchups to where you never want to play this card, so you just want to use it as a cycle tool, and that's why I love this. And that's another reason why Royal Librarian, another fantastic tech card in this deck, and I believe Savitz put it in his tweet why exactly this is in the deck, but I'm assuming this is for like an aggressive deck that buffs up a card. Let me actually check this. And it turns out the reason why the silence is in the deck is because you want to be able to stop the slime against Warlock. So now that makes a lot of sense on why that card is in the deck, because the fun thing about these cards is that you can automatically win the game. But I would also argue that's the reason why they're so frustrating to go up against, is because they're like, hey, I played my slime, I did the thing. Oh, and it got silenced and I can't do anything now. I'm not really too sure on how people's opinions are on these two cards, but I at least find it interesting that they are seeing play. Now we're going to start getting to some more of these fun decks, but the fun decks actually have some pretty impressive ranks attached to them. So when you check out where some of these decks can go, you might be changing your mind on what exactly is a meme. But to give you an idea of what actually for sure is a meme, Blackrock and Roll. I hate to say it, but I was on the copium on the very first 24 hours of the patch thinking that this was good, and I had some really good high rolls that I will be highlighting in future videos, so if you like this kind of content, make sure you like this video, subscribe, yada yada yada. But oh my god, the Blackrock and Roll high roll, dude, when you can play Lorthamar on top is just insane. But the reason why the Lorthamar is in the ETC is because this isn't our main win condition anymore. Our main win condition is still playing Blackrock and Roll, but more so, it's Last Stand. Last Stand with Flesh Shaper and with Silver Fury Stalwart is actually insanely consistent because they're both, you know, available for 6 mana. So on turn 7, you can get the double the stats, you can double your Flesh Shaper, you can double your Sun Fury Stalwart, and have a gigantic wall that a lot of that a lot of decks that are weak against taunt just cannot deal with because of how massive these minions are. Like, imagine doubling up the Flesh Shaper. That's a 16 minion, and if you summon a copy of that, you've doubled the double. But if you double the double, which doubles the double, then you can have I think it's a 72 112 stat line all in one turn if you hit the absolute nuts. And that was just the reason why I had to play this deck, is because it just seemed really fun, and I had a somewhat decent win rate with this deck. But trust me, this is way more of a meme. I like the idea of Festival Security in this deck, because if you do happen to play Blackrock and Roll and then you play Last Stand and you don't hit one of the big boys but you still hit a Festival Security, that is a 10 attack minion that can still do, you know, a decent amount of clearing onto the board as long as you finale it. But there's a lot of really cool things with this deck, like Rockmaster Voon, for example. There's been a lot of people talking about Trench Stalker, you know, do you run 1, do you run 2, do you run any at all? And I think that 1 is the perfect, like, the perfect middle ground, so that way you can always have at least one card in your deck that gets buffed by Blackrock and Roll to give you a legitimate win condition, like your Olgra, like your Romornia, for example. But the reason why I love Voon is because you can make copies of your Trench Stalker in case having that second copy is really, really important. Plus making extra copies of really big Nagas, really big... oh, I thought this was a beast for a second. The Flesh Shaper is also undead, so being able to copy that can sometimes be important. There's actually a lot more tribe cards in this deck than you would think, like... Okay, well, Finley doesn't really count. It's mostly just the Ogre. It's just mostly the Flesh Shaper, the School Teacher, and the Trench Stalker. But I think that Rockmaster Voon kind of makes it in this deck if you want to run a second copy of Trench Stalker, but you don't actually want to have a really expensive card that is always a dead card in your hand. But it's also a way to make From the Depths work, and I hate to say it, but From the Depths didn't break Hearthstone. It actually made Warrior a little bit more balanced, and maybe this is the designers doing the right thing, changing this card to discount by 2 instead of discounting by 3, because who knows? With Enrage Warrior being the best deck in the game right now, if they did make this 3 mana, discount 15 mana, and then play Finley and play everything that you can all in one turn, it might have been busted. It might actually have been busted. And it really wouldn't be a Clark HELLSCREAM decks video unless I'm telling you about Naga Mage, because apparently there is one person that is trying to make Lightshow Naga Mage into a legitimate deck. Stinzy on Twitter ended up posting this on the first day of the patch, saying that he really liked this idea of the deck, climbing from 2.2k to about 1k with it, playing about 50 games of Naga Mage, but today this was the list that really popped. It has to be said that this was during the first 24 hours of the patch, so there was probably a lot of experimenting going on, and I hate to say it, this deck might have some wins boosted just a little bit, and that's the reason why I'm saying that it is quote-unquote a meme deck. But I do believe that Stinzy is an extremely good player, and he wouldn't be posting this without good legitimate reasons, so I'm going to go ahead and highlight it for that reason. But if you do better with this deck, mate, let me know, because I really want this deck to be good. This was like my go-to. I hope this deck is playable and good, because when you pop off Lightshow, extremely consistency because of the Siren combos, it's just really fun in my opinion. But there is one more Naga Mage that is still good. It's the original list that we were playing from the very beginning, except we don't run mistakes anymore. We are now running treasure guards. And I do believe that this deck has a lot of potential, but this guy right here is killing it with this deck. He has been... he was around like top 100 legend before the patch even started, but now a couple of days after the patch, as of yesterday, he's now top 10 legend with Naga Mage. So all you Naga Mage deniers, all you people that just hate on Naga Mage or hate on Mage as a class, you now have to sit in this copium of knowing that if you do play the deck very well, you can do good against the decks like Relic, Demon Hunter, because it does make sense. If you pop off the combo by turn 4, turn 5, you are going to absolutely dominate the board. But this deck does do very well against a lot of the meta-relevant decks like Relic, Demon Hunter, for example. But I really do believe this is just one of those decks to where you have to understand every single nook and cranny, every single win condition. You can't pick any bad cards because knowing what to pick off of Vast Wisdom and knowing when to go for the combo is the hardest part of this deck. But someone can reach top 10 legend with it. Why can't you? And the last deck that I'm going to show you guys is actually a control mage, and it's really sad to say that all of the mage decks are kind of memes right now, but this deck has like some pretty interesting ways of being considered legitimate, because against Demon Hunter, this deck does extremely well because you have a bunch of life gain, you deny their board a lot of the time, although Relic Demon Hunter is kind of excluded from this because it doesn't fall victim to the Deathborn like Outcast Demon Hunter does. But if you're going up against a lot of aggressive Demon Hunter decks, this can still be an extremely interesting way of playing Mage, and it's one of the only ways of being able to play Sire Denathrius. That's right, Denathrius is no longer a Druid card, it is now a Mage card, because you're playing a lot of skeletons for relatively cheap, and you can bring them back, you know, with Kel'Thuzad, and you can, you know, play Queen into Ring, double Deathborn, get a whole bunch of minions. Like, it just makes sense why Sire Denathrius would go in this deck as not just a way to kill your opponent, but as a way of being able to restabilize in case you've used all your alibis and you're sitting at like 2 HP or something like that. So Sire Denathrius makes sense in this kind of deck, and if you look at all the cards, like, this looks like it should be a meta-relevant top-tier deck because of how much armor gain it has, how much AoE it has, how it has actual ways of dealing damage. But the thing that's keeping this deck from being a top tier deck is that its card draws. Its card draws and its curve are so important to where if you don't hit the 1-on-1, the 2-on-2, the 3-on-3 in some situations, you just have to play from behind as early as turn 3, turn 4, to where you're playing Nightcloak Sanctum in order to stop a card from killing you, instead of playing a Nerubian's Vizier in order to go for like a proactive game plan, discover more options. You have to play very defensively with this deck, and you have to be able to tell when am I playing too defensively too quickly, and when am I being too greedy with my proactive turns and I'm just getting smacked by the board that the Demon Hunter is generating. So this is a deck that requires a little bit more finesse, although it is definitely not a top tier meta relevant deck because people can't seem to make this work at top 1000 legend. But I had to put it on this list because it is one of the more fun control decks that I have played, and I would much rather this be the norm than Control Priest. And the last thing that I'll go over in this video is Norwis's post. Apparently he's going to do this every single time a patch goes live, but he has put out his own top decks tweet, I guess is the best way to put it, claiming that Relic Demon Hunter is number 1, Outcast Demon Hunter is tier 2, followed by Control Priest, Enrage Warrior, and Miracle Rogue, then Spooky Mage, tier 3, surprised to see that, followed by Frost and Unholy DK, Blood DK completely out of the picture now. Jailer Druid, I don't believe is even tier 3. I do believe this deck is now 100% dead because you are not going to be able to find enough positive matchups with Jailer Druid in order to justify running it on ladder. And then Big Demon Hunter is tier 3, which I feel like should be above Jailer Druid, but if you're playing anything else according to Norwis, it is tier 4, quote-unquote, not worth it. But here are the lists that he's promoting. The same old Relic Demon Hunter list. This is really not changed all too much. Is exactly the same deck that I showed you earlier. Outcast Demon Hunter, I believe is exactly the same with the Ranchers. Priest, this looks like Meati's list. The Warrior is running 2 Acolyte of Pains instead of an Instrument Tech. I would highly recommend subbing out 1 Acolyte of Pain for Instrument Tech just to give us a more consistent turn 2 play. Miracle Rogue, the differences here is that we subbed out a Cult Neophyte and a Fan of Knives for a Door of Shadows, I believe. Not really too sure about that, but I'm not really a rogue player, so I can't refute it. Mage looks exactly as I expected. Oh, whoa, wait a minute. No, this is not what I expected. There's no Renathal. This is just control 30 card. Okay, hold on a minute. There's a deck here I wasn't anticipating. And then you have Frosty K, which subbed out Astalor for a Harbinger of Winter. Regular Ode Tony Druid. I don't believe there's anything new in this deck. It's just the same deck that was really good before the patch. And then Big Demon Hunter, exactly the same deck, but it did technically get nerfed because of Fellscale Evoker being changed. So those are all the decks that I have to showcase to you with as many different opinions as I can gather. And you're only going to find this kind of content in one place. So make sure you like this video, subscribe, yada yada yada. I've already told you to do that a couple of times. So I'm just going to go ahead and wrap up this video by saying, one, mana changes are impactful. They do make a difference at the end of the day, especially with how many, archetypes that were completely a joke that are now legitimately seeing play. And maybe not like top tier like Warlock, for example, but Warlock definitely feels a lot better if you're playing Thaddius and if you're playing Control. I'm still not sold on Curses all too much, even though the Savitz deck does have some good stats to back it up. But I am just I'm on the Warrior train, and I'm going to be riding that Warrior train all day long. But hopefully most of you found at least one deck in this video that makes you want to play Hearthstone, because I will say that Enrage Warrior is that one deck for me, and I'm going to be playing it a lot these next couple of days. So hopefully I'll be able to showcase some other decks so I can keep, some variety on this stream. But if I keep winning with Warrior, who knows? Maybe we'll try going for rank 1 Legend. I doubt it'll happen, but it's still a good fun goal to try and keep in mind. I hope you guys enjoy playing at least one of these decks in this video, and I hope that, you guys are enjoying Hearthstone right now. And we'll see you for the next video.